The stench of burning flesh still clung to the castle stones when the last screams fell silent in the early hours of 1439. Deep in Machecoul, where torchlight barely penetrated the darkness of the subterranean corridors, something monstrous had been consummated. Baron Gilles de Rais, once comrade-in-arms of Joan of Arc and hero of France, stared with glazed eyes at the outcome of his most recent experiment. On the stone table, fragments of human skin still dripped congealed blood, while, beside them, in bronze vessels, the melted fat of children was beginning to harden. It was raw material for his macabre candles, the illumination he believed necessary to commune with the forces of darkness. The sweet, nauseating odor of infant death mingled with the incense burned during satanic rites, creating an atmosphere that would have driven even demons back in horror. Gilles de Montmorency-Laval, Baron de Rais, had been born in 1404 in a France torn apart by the 100 Years' War, inheriting not only vast lands and unimaginable wealth, but also a lineage that traced back to the time of Charlemagne. Orphaned of his father by age 6, he was raised by his paternal grandfather, Jean de Craon, a man of violent temperament and boundless ambition who shaped the boy's character through brutal lessons on power and domination. Champtocé Castle, the family residence, stood like a dark fortress over the Loire River, its Gothic towers casting shadows that seemed to foreshadow the darkness that would one day inhabit its air. From a young age, Gilles displayed exceptional intelligence, absorbing knowledge of Latin, history, and military strategy with a veracity that impressed his tutors. But there was something unsettling in his blue eyes, a premature coldness that made servants avoid meeting his gaze. By the time he inherited the ancestral lands at age 20, Gilles de Rais was the wealthiest man in France, after the king himself. His properties stretched across vast swaths of Brittany and Anjou. His coffers overflowed with gold, and his influence at court was undisputed. Tall, of noble bearing, and with refined features, he wore his beard carefully trimmed according to the fashion of the time, and dressed in silks and velvets that cost a fortune. His hands, always perfumed with Eastern oils, had never known hard work, and his long, pale fingers bore rings set with precious stones that glittered like stars at noble gatherings. When he strode through the halls of his castle, the sound of his fine leather boots echoed with absolute authority, and all bowed in reverence before the young baron who personified feudal power in its most sublime form. In 1427, at age 23, Gilles met Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who claimed to have divine visions and a sacred mission to drive the English from French soil. Something in the mystical intensity of the young woman awakened in Gilles a fascination that transcended mere political curiosity. Joan spoke of celestial voices with a conviction that electrified the air around her, and her eyes burned with a faith that seemed capable of moving mountains. For Gilles, accustomed to the calculating skepticism of the nobility, that spiritual purity represented something new and magnetic. He decided to fund the Maid of Orléans campaign with his own resources, outfitting entire armies and becoming Joan's right-hand man in military affairs. Side by side, they rode to besieged Orléans, where Gilles displayed exceptional courage in battle, fighting with a ferocity that impressed even hardened veterans. During the months he accompanied Joan, Gilles experienced what was perhaps the only genuinely luminous period of his existence. In the military tents, by the light of firewood that crackled in the night, he would listen to the young woman's fervent prayers and felt something akin to spiritual redemption. Joan treated him like an older brother, confiding in him secrets about her visions and asking for his counsel on military strategy. There were moments when the Baron came to believe that God truly spoke through that illiterate peasant girl, and that he himself had been chosen to partake in a divine mission. After the liberation of Orléans, when Charles VII was crowned in Reims with Joan and Gilles at his side, the Baron experienced a glory he had never known before. There he was, at the center of French power, recognized as a national hero, Marshal of the kingdom at 25, with a future shining before him like a golden promise. But in May of 1431, everything collapsed when Joan was captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English. Gilles, who was on his estates when he received the news, felt something die inside him. The young woman who had embodied divine light in his life was now a prisoner of the enemy, destined for the stake on charges of heresy. For months, he moved heaven and earth attempting to organize a rescue, spending fortunes on bribes and conspiracies that never came to fruition. On May 30th, 1431, when flames consumed Joan of Arc in the Rouen marketplace, something in Gilles de Rais' soul broke irrevocably. Witnesses reported that upon receiving the news, the Baron remained silent for hours, staring blankly as if contemplating an invisible abyss opening before him. The months that followed Joan's death marked the beginning of a terrifying transformation in Gilles' personality. The national hero withdrew to his domains, avoiding court and the social obligations that once defined him. His servants noticed disturbing changes in his behavior: long nighttime promenades through the castle corridors, whispered conversations with himself, and a growing obsession with books on alchemy and necromancy that he had fetched from distant monasteries. The Baron, who once dressed with princely elegance, began wearing dark, almost monkish garments, and his beard, formerly carefully trimmed, grew wild and unkempt. His eyes, once lively and penetrating, acquired a deadened quality, as if something essential had extinguished in their depths. The first concrete manifestation of his new obsession came through Francesco Prelati, a young Italian cleric who arrived at Machecoul Castle in 1432. Prelati, only 22, possessed extensive knowledge of alchemy, astrology, and the occult arts, having studied forbidden texts in secret libraries in Florence and Rome. He was a small man, with delicate features and dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. When he presented himself to Gilles as someone capable of summoning demons and transmuting base metals into gold, he found a listener both eager and desperate. The Baron, whose fortunes were dwindling due to excessive spending on luxuries and his failed attempts to rescue Joan, saw in black magic a possibility not only to recover his wealth, but also to gain the supernatural power he had observed in his former comrade-in-arms. Under Prelati's guidance, Gilles ordered the construction of a secret laboratory deep within the castle's foundations, where damp stone walls muffled any sound that might escape to the outside world. There, surrounded by alembics, furnaces, leather-bound grimoires, and Kabbalistic symbols etched on the floor, the Baron initiated the darkest rituals of medieval magic. The earliest experiments involved animal sacrifices, whose blood was poured into magic circles, while Prelati intoned invocations in corrupted Latin. But gradually, as demons refused to manifest, the demands of the rituals became more extreme. Prelati explained in a soft, hypnotic voice that the infernal forces required more precious offerings, more innocent, more pure. Human blood was necessary, preferably that of children, to open the gates of hell and reveal its treasures. The Chidouille first victim was an 8-year-old peasant boy, son of a serf, working on the Baron's lands. The child disappeared one autumn afternoon in 1433 while playing near the castle walls. Officially, it was believed he had fallen into the moat or been attacked by wolves, explanations that Gilles publicly endorsed, even offering to pay for the funeral. In reality, the boy had been taken to the underground laboratory, where Gilles and Prelati conducted their first human sacrifice. The ritual was carried out at midnight, by the light of black candles, with the Baron wearing a tunic embroidered with satanic symbols. The terrified and bewildered child was placed on a stone altar as demonic invocations echoed off the damp walls. When the ceremonial knife slashed across the child's throat, Gilles experienced a sensation of power and ecstasy unlike anything he had known, an experience that made him believe he had finally found a way to transcend his mortal condition. But no demon answered that night, nor on the nights that followed. Prelati explained that the rituals needed refinement, that more sacrifices were required, that the technique was not yet perfected. And so, gradually, the disappearances of children in the region began to multiply. Sons of peasants, orphans from nearby towns, impoverished urchins who no one would mourn, all were lured to the castle with promises of work, food, or money. Once inside Machecoul's walls, they were never seen again. Gilles devised an elaborate system for these abductions, employing trusted servants to roam neighboring villages, identifying vulnerable targets, and inventing pretexts to bring them to the castle. As the sacrifices multiplied, Gilles discovered that the act of killing had become more important than the magical objectives themselves. There was something in the terror in the children's eyes, in the sound of their muffled screams echoing through the stone corridors, in the warm texture of blood running between his fingers that awakened indescribable sensations within him. He began prolonging the rituals, experimenting with different forms of torture before the final sacrifice. The victims were kept in underground cells for days, fed and tended like prized animals before slaughter. Gilles visited them regularly, watching them with scientific fascination, studying how fear transformed their expressions, how hope gradually died in their young faces. The process of crafting candles from human fat developed naturally from these experiments. Initially, Gilles simply burned the bodies in special furnaces built below ground, but Prelati suggested that the melted fat could be repurposed for ritual use. According to ancient texts they consulted, candles made from the fat of innocent children held special magical properties, capable of illuminating both the physical and spiritual worlds. Thus Gilles began developing meticulous techniques to extract and process the fat of his victims. The bodies were skinned with surgical precision, the hide removed in long uniform strips and set out to dry. The subcutaneous fat was carefully separated from the flesh, melted in specialized cauldrons, and strained through fine cloth until it became a creamy, translucent substance. The entire process took several hours and required an almost artistic precision. Gilles, who had never before soiled his hands with manual labor, discovered a disturbing aptitude for this macabre task. His once delicate, perfumed hands became adept at wielding flaying knives, developing precise, economical movements that maximized the yield of the raw material. The extracted fat was then mixed with beeswax and scented with eastern spices, creating candles that burned with a strangely bluish flame and emitted a sweet, cloying perfume that partially masked the underlying odor of human flesh. These candles were used exclusively in the most important rituals, illuminating demonic invocations with a light Gilles believed to be sacred to the forces of darkness. Between 1433 and 1440, it is estimated that more than 200 children disappeared from the lands controlled by Gilles de Rais. The exact number was never determined, as many victims were orphans or children of peasant families lacking the means to investigate disappearances. Those who dared to question the Baron were swiftly silenced through bribes, threats, or simply vanished without a trace. The climate of terror in the region was palpable. Mothers hid their children when they saw the Baron's men approach, and whispers about curses and demonic pacts circulated in taverns in hushed voices stifled by fear. Some braver peasants attempted to organize searches on the castle grounds, but were driven away by armed guards claiming direct orders from the feudal lord. Meanwhile, Gilles' financial situation deteriorated rapidly. His alchemical experiments consumed fortunes in rare equipment and exotic ingredients imported from distant lands. Prelati convinced him that specific magical objects were necessary to perfect the rituals. Obsidian mirrors from Mexico, powders made from Egyptian mummies, crystals consecrated in Asian temples, manuscripts penned by Arabian magi. Each item and cost astronomical sums, yet Gilles paid without hesitation, convinced that he would soon obtain the supernatural power he sought. Additionally, he maintained a princely lifestyle even in isolation, hosting sumptuous banquets for the few visitors he still received, purchasing luxurious garments he seldom wore, and funding religious artworks in a contradictory attempt to balance his sins with acts of devotion. In 1435, forced by mounting debts, Gilles began selling his ancestral properties. First, the less productive lands, then secondary castles, and finally estates that had belonged to his family for generations. Each sale struck a blow to his aristocratic pride, but he justified himself with the promise that demons would soon deliver treasures, making these sacrifices irrelevant. His brother Rais and other close relatives tried to intervene, organizing family councils where they begged Gilles to abandon his obsessions and return to a normal life. But the Baron received their pleas with growing coldness, distancing himself ever further from anyone who questioned his activities. Paranoia began to dominate his thoughts as the years passed without any demonic manifestations. Gilles grew suspicious of everyone around him, including Prelati, who began suggesting that perhaps the rituals were being sabotaged by divine forces. The Italian, sensing his patron's dwindling patience, intensified the rituals and spun ever more elaborate explanations for the invocation's failures. According to him, the guardian angels of the sacrificed children interfered with the rituals, and it was necessary to find even purer victims or develop more extreme techniques to neutralize the celestial protection. These explanations only fueled Gilles' obsession, leading him to seek increasingly younger victims, reaching the point of sacrificing infants just a few months old. The methods of torture also became more sophisticated over time. What had begun as relatively quick murders during magical rites evolved into a systematic exploration of different forms of suffering. Gilles discovered that prolonging his victim's agony heightened his own excitement, and he began experimenting with torture methods he had learned from medieval treatises on the Inquisition and criminal justice. Some children were kept alive for weeks, tortured incrementally while Gilles observed their reactions with scientific interest. He kept detailed journals of these experiments, recording methods, durations, victim reactions, and his own feelings during the process. The subterranean laboratory became a gallery of horrors, surpassing the darkest fantasies of Gothic novels. In addition to traditional alchemical apparatus, Gilles installed medieval torture instruments: rack, heated pincers, fingernail pullers, and whips tipped with metal. The walls were covered in satanic symbols painted with the victim's blood, and special niches held the skulls of sacrificed children, each marked with the date of death and details of the corresponding ritual. The perpetual stench of death, incense, and chemical substances created an atmosphere that made even the most loyal servants avoid the corridors leading to the dungeons. During this period, Gilles also became obsessed with religious texts, compulsively reading scriptures and theological works in a contradictory attempt to understand the nature of the evil he had embraced. His chambers filled with holy books, he studied with the same intensity he devoted to demonic grimoires, seeking passages that might justify or explain his actions. Sometimes he would spend entire nights reading aloud passages from Revelation or the Book of Job, as if searching for divine signs that never arrived. This contradiction between religious devotion and satanic practice plunged him into extreme agitation, alternating between moments of mystical fervor and bouts of despair that left him prostrate for days. By 1439, Gilles' financial situation had become unsustainable. He had sold nearly all his important properties, dismissed most of his servants, and his creditors were pressing for payments he could not make. Prelati, realizing that the funding had dried up, proposed one final desperate attempt, a so powerful demon-summoning ritual that would guarantee Satan himself's immediate appearance. According to the Italian, it would be necessary to sacrifice 7 virgin children simultaneously, using their fats to create a giant candle that would burn for 3 consecutive days. The ritual had to take place during a lunar eclipse, within a magic circle painted with fresh blood, while satanic prayers were chanted in archaic Latin. Preparations for this final ritual took months. Gilles ordered the kidnapping of children from distant villages to avoid local suspicion, keeping them in separate cells to ensure they remained virgins and pure. He built a new, even larger laboratory in the deepest cellars of the castle, decorated with satanic frescoes painted by artists who were executed after completing their work to guarantee secrecy. The giant candle was created using the fat of dozens of earlier victims, standing nearly 2 meters tall and perfumed with newborn's blood. When the eclipse night finally arrived, Gilles descended to the dungeons wearing a black tunic embroidered with gold threads, carrying a ceremonial dagger whose hilt was inlaid with rubies that gleamed like drops of blood. The ritual began at midnight, with the eclipse at its zenith. The 7 children, aged between 5 and 10, were brought one by one to the magic circle, while Gilles and Prelati intoned invocations that echoed through the stone vaults like condemned souls' wails. Each sacrifice was carried out according to specific techniques described in the oldest grimoires, with blood poured into geometric patterns that supposedly opened portals to infernal dimensions. The giant candle was lit with a flame fueled by the children's blood, and its bluish light filled the laboratory with dancing shadows that seemed to come alive. For hours, Gilles shouted demonic invocations until his voice was hoarse, pleading for Lucifer's manifestation and offering his soul in exchange for unlimited power. But again, nothing happened. When the eclipse ended and dawn began to lighten the sky, silence and the sweet stench of death alone filled the laboratory. Gilles, exhausted and covered in dried blood, surveyed the children's bodies strewn across the stone floor and finally realized he had been deceived. Prelati, sensing the change in his patron's mood, tried to explain that perhaps the demons were testing his devotion, that more time and sacrifices were needed. But Gilles cut him off with a look that froze the Italian's blood. For the first time in years, his eyes regained a terrible clarity, as if he were finally awakening from a nightmare of his own making. What followed was a massacre whose brutality surpassed everything that had gone before. Gilles killed Prelati with his own hands, strangling him slowly as the Italian scrambled to explain why the rituals had failed. Then he turned on the servants, who had participated in the sacrifices, executing them one by one with a mechanical coldness that contrasted starkly with the passion he had shown during the rites. Within hours, everyone who knew his secrets lay dead, their bodies scattered through the subterranean corridors like broken dolls. Machecoul Castle became a silent necropolis, where only Gilles walked among corpses and shadows, finally alone with the full magnitude of his crimes. In the days that followed the slaughter, Gilles wandered through the empty chambers like a ghost of his former self. His appearance, already deteriorated by years of obsession, became even more terrifying. His luxurious garments were replaced by rags stained with blood. His beard grew tangled and filthy, and his eyes acquired a feral quality reminiscent of wounded animals. He spoke to himself constantly, sometimes whispering prayers, other times shouting blasphemies against God and the devil who had abandoned him. In the castle mirrors, he no longer recognized the elegant young baron he had once been. Instead, he saw a pathetic, cursed creature, forever stained by the crimes he had committed. News of his atrocities reached Pierre de l'Hôpital, a Breton noble investigating his own son's disappearance on Gilles' lands. Pierre had hired spies who infiltrated the castle during the confusion following the servants' massacre, uncovering irrefutable evidence of murder in the underground laboratories. The children's skulls, the torture instruments, Gilles' detailed journals, and the human fat candles were all documented and reported to ecclesiastical and secular authorities. When the Duke of Brittany's soldiers arrived at Machecoul in September 1440, they found Gilles sitting on his throne, wearing a blood-stained tunic, surrounded by the decomposing bodies of his last victims. Gilles de Rais's trial began in October 1440 before a tribunal presided over by the Bishop of Nantes and the Duke of Brittany. The charges included heresy, sodomy, murder, necromancy, and pacting with the devil. For weeks, witnesses recounted the children's disappearances, the satanic practices in the castle, and the horrors discovered in the subterranean laboratories. Gilles himself, initially defiant and arrogant, gradually crumbled under the weight of the evidence. His attempts to deny the crimes were thwarted by the journals he himself had written, documenting each sacrifice with meticulous detail. The judges, men hardened by experience with criminal cases, were visibly shaken as they heard accounts of the human fat candles and torture experiments. On October 21, 1440, confronted with irrefutable evidence and the threat of judicial torture, Gilles finally confessed his crimes before the court. His confession, read in a trembling voice for over 2 hours, shocked even the most seasoned judges. He admitted to personally killing more than 100 children, describing torture methods, satanic rituals, and the production of macabre candles with a frankness that bordered on the scientific. He explained how he had gradually lost his humanity, becoming a creature driven only by the lust for supernatural power and sadistic pleasure. When he finished speaking, a deadly silence engulfed the court, broken only by the muffled sobs of a few who could not contain their emotion. The sentence was read 3 days later, death by hanging and burning with confiscation of all remaining property. Gilles received the verdict with surprising calmness, as if he had finally found the peace he had sought for years. In the final days before his execution, he displayed signs of genuine remorse, begging forgiveness from the victims' families and donating his last resources to masses for the children's souls. Some observers suggested this final transformation was merely another performance, but others believed they detected a desperate sincerity in his gestures of contrition. On the morning of October 26, 1440, thousands of people gathered in Nantes Square to witness the execution of the Bluebeard Baron, as Gilles had been nicknamed by contemporary chroniclers due to the splendid attire he used to wear in his glory days. When he was led to the scaffold, his appearance was unrecognizable. The young hero who had once fought alongside Joan of Arc had become a skeletal figure with grey hair and sunken eyes that seemed to gaze upon invisible landscapes. He wore a simple penitential tunic, and his hands, once adept at wielding both swords and torture instruments, trembled uncontrollably as he held a wooden crucifix. The executioner, a seasoned man who had performed hundreds of executions, later confessed he had never seen a condemned man so serene before death. Gilles mounted the scaffold unaided, addressed the crowd in a clear voice, and asked forgiveness for the crimes he had committed. He declared that his soul was finally at peace, that he had found God again after years wandering through darkness, and that he hoped his death would serve as an example to others who might be tempted by evil's paths. When the noose was placed around his neck, he whispered a prayer nobody could fully hear, but witnesses swore they detected the words "forgiveness" and "innocent children" among his final murmurs. The execution was carried out at 9 in the morning under a grey sky threatening rain. When the trapdoor opened and Gilles dropped, an absolute silence enveloped the square, broken only by the creak of the rope and the muted sobs of some women. In the crowd, his body swayed for long minutes before falling still, and then it was lowered to be burned on a pyre prepared especially for the occasion. The flames consumed the former baron's gaunt figure quickly, and within hours only ashes remained, ashes scattered in the Loire so that no physical trace of Gilles de Rais would remain on the earth. In the weeks following the execution, expeditions were organized to explore Machecoul Castle's subterranean depths fully. What they found surpassed the worst expectations. Secret chambers filled with children's skeletons, furnaces where still charred bones testified to recent massacres, and repositories containing hundreds of candles made from human fat. Investigators also discovered Gilles's personal library, containing over 200 volumes on black magic, some written in ink that later analyses would reveal to be human blood. Detailed maps of the estates showed clandestine burial sites, where more bodies were exhumed, raising the total number of victims to figures that shocked even those accustomed to medieval violence. Among the most disturbing findings was an intimate diary in which Gilles recorded not only technical details of the murders, but also his personal reflections on the nature of evil and redemption. Entire pages were devoted to describing his feelings during the rituals, revealing a mind that had plunged into depravity, depths rarely documented in human history. "Today I understood that God has utterly abandoned me," he wrote in an entry dated 1438, "and that only in darkness can I find any purpose for my cursed existence." Other passages showed glimpses of conscience about the monstrosity of his acts, followed by elaborate rationalizations justifying the continuation of his crimes. The psychological impact of these discoveries on the investigators was devastating. Several soldiers involved in the excavations developed recurring nightmares and abandoned military service, unable to process the horrors they had witnessed. Pierre de l'Hôpital himself, whose initial investigations led to uncovering the crimes, never fully recovered from the trauma of confirming his worst suspicions about his son's fate. Years later, he still wandered taverns recounting macabre details that few dared to hear, like a man condemned to relive forever the moment when the innocence of his faith in humanity was shattered beyond repair. Gilles' remaining castles were systematically demolished by ducal order, their stones scattered or repurposed in secular buildings to prevent them from becoming sites of macabre pilgrimage. But physical destruction could not erase the memory of the crimes, which spread across France through popular ballads, ecclesiastical sermons, and travelers' accounts. Gilles de Rais' name became synonymous with absolute evil, a cultural reference that endured for centuries as the most extreme example of human capacity for wickedness. French mothers began using his story to frighten disobedient children, and his figure gradually transformed into the folkloric character who, centuries later, would inspire the tales of Bluebeard. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Gilles' legacy was not the monstrosity of his crimes, but the normalcy of his early years. Here was a man who began life with every imaginable advantage: wealth, social position, refined education, and even the opportunity to participate in a genuinely noble cause alongside Joan of Arc. His transformation from national hero to sadistic monster raised haunting questions about human nature and civilization's fragility. If someone like Gilles, born into nobility and educated in the highest Christian values, could descend to such depths of depravity, what hope remained for humanity as a whole? Theologians of the time pored over his case, attempting to understand how God could have allowed such wickedness to flourish. Some argued that Gilles represented a divine test of collective faith, a trial akin to the tribulations described in the Book of Job. Others saw in his story a demonstration of humanity's absolute need for divine grace to remain on the path of righteousness. There were also those who whispered in private conversations that perhaps Satan himself had walked the earth in Gilles de Rais' form, using a human body to perpetrate horrors no mortal could conceive. The question of collective culpability also haunted the Baron's contemporaries. How had so many people allowed the crimes to continue for so long? Hundreds of servants, soldiers, lesser nobles and clerics had come into contact with Gilles during his years of degeneration, and many must have suspected something terrible was happening on his estates. Feudal society's complicit silence, where a lord's word was absolute law and questioning authority meant certain death, had created the perfect environment for evil to thrive unimpeded. This grim reflection forced a painful re-evaluation of medieval social structures and the price society paid for its rigid hierarchy. The Catholic Church also faced difficult questions about its responsibility in the case. Gilles had been educated in religious institutions, participated regularly in sacraments, and even funded charitable Christian work simultaneously with his most horrific crimes. How had spiritual leaders failed to detect or prevent such a profound corruption of the soul? The official response emphasized free will and the human capacity to choose evil even when exposed to good. But this explanation did little to satisfy those seeking to understand evil's deepest roots. In the years following his execution, reports of supernatural phenomena surfaced on Gilles' former properties. Peasants claimed to hear children's cries coming from Machecoul's ruins during stormy nights. Travelers reported sightings of a spectral figure wandering the ruined courtyards, always carrying a candle burning with a blue flame, even in pouring rain. Some swore they saw ghostly children playing in the abandoned gardens, vanishing instantly. When approached, although the church officially discouraged such superstitions, many local clerics secretly believed that Gilles' crimes had permanently scarred the land, creating a spiritual wound that would never fully heal. Gilles de Rais' influence extended far beyond his own era, inspiring generations of writers, artists, and criminologists to explore the depths of human evil. His story became one of the earliest documented cases of serial murder in Western history, studied by scholars aiming to understand sadistic predators' behavioral patterns. The meticulous nature of his personal records provided unique insights into a killer's mind, someone combining superior intelligence with absolute depravity, forming a psychological profile that anticipated modern psychopathy studies by centuries. During the Renaissance, humanists like Montaigne reflected on Gilles' case as an example of humanity's capacity to contain both divine and demonic elements within a single personality. The apparent contradiction between his heroic early years and subsequent degeneration challenged the simplistic notions of human nature that dominated medieval thought. Gilles was neither merely evil from birth nor a saint corrupted solely by external influences. Rather, he was a complex being whose story revealed the terrible malleability of the human soul when exposed to extreme circumstances. The production of candles from human fat, in particular, continued to haunt Europe's collective imagination. This practice, combining religious sacrilege with profanation of the dead and the blasphemous use of innocent bodies, represented an evil beyond normal human depravity. The fact that Gilles had turned his victims into utilitarian ritual objects added a layer of dehumanization that echoed in later crimes throughout history. The image of candles made from children's fat became a potent symbol of absolute evil, referenced in literary texts and theological treatises as the supreme example of humanity's ability to profane the sacred. Later studies revealed that Gilles was not an isolated case, but rather the most extreme representative of an aristocratic culture that often equated absolute power with unlimited moral license. Other nobles of the time practiced similar abuses, though rarely on such a grand scale or with such detailed documentation. The crucial difference was that Gilles combined aristocratic sadism with occult obsession, creating a destructive synergy that amplified his capacity for suffering. His refined education, rather than serving as a moral barrier, provided him with intellectual tools to rationalize and systematize his evil in ways no common criminal could conceive. Gilles' desperate quest for supernatural power also reflected broader anxieties in late medieval society, facing profound social, economic, and religious upheavals. The 100 Years' War had devastated France, the Black Death had decimated populations, and the Great Schism had split Christendom. In this existential crisis, the promise of magical control over supernatural forces held a powerful appeal for minds already unmoored by the loss of stable reference points. Gilles embodied this desperate search for certainty and control, taken to extremes that exposed the spiritual void beneath his apparent cultural sophistication. Ironically, it was only in the face of death that Gilles seemed to regain some glimmer of humanity. His final days in prison, marked by genuine contrition and desperate attempts to make peace with God, suggested that even the most corrupted soul might contain a spark of moral awareness capable of awakening when confronted with eternity. This final transformation, real or feigned, raises complex questions about redemption and the possibility of forgiveness for crimes that seem to exceed the limits of the forgivable. Gilles' execution, witnessed by thousands, represented more than the death of a single criminal. It was a collective purification ritual, society's attempt to symbolically rid itself of the moral contamination his crimes represented. Yet as subsequent events showed, burning his body did not extinguish his cultural influence, nor answer the fundamental questions his life raised about human nature, power, and moral responsibility. In the end, Gilles de Rais' story remains one of the most extreme examples of humanity's capacity for both good and evil. His transformation from national hero to sadistic monster serves as a perpetual warning about civilization's fragility and the need for constant vigilance against destructive impulses lurking potentially within all human societies. The candles, made from his infant victim's fat, continue to burn metaphorically in collective memory, their sinister light illuminating the darkest corners of the human soul and reminding us that the distance between light and darkness, between sanctity and perdition, may be smaller than we ever dared to imagine.